It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon in the middle of nowhere, the kind of place where time seemed to move slower. The diner sat just off a lonely stretch of highway, surrounded by fields that stretched as far as the eye could see. It was the sort of spot where people only stopped if they needed a quick bite or a moment to rest on their way to somewhere more important. Or, in some cases, if they were looking to disappear for a while. Inside, the diner was cozy but worn, its linoleum floor scuffed from years of footsteps and its booths showing the kind of wear that comes from countless conversations, spilled coffees, and quiet moments. The air smelled of strong coffee and sizzling bacon, a comforting combination that seemed to fit the place perfectly. Behind the counter, the cook, an older man with a weathered face and a belly that spoke of too many late-night snacks, flipped a pancake with practiced ease. The waitress, a woman in her late 50s with silver streaks in her hair, moved between the tables like she had done it 1,000 times before. Her name tag read Doris, and her kind smile had a way of making even the most tired traveler feel at ease. She hummed softly as she refilled a customer's coffee cup, her movements smooth and unhurried. In the corner of the diner, by the window, a man sat alone. His name was Sam. He was a quiet figure, the kind of man who didn't draw attention to himself. He wore a faded brown jacket over a plain t-shirt and a pair of jeans that had seen better days. His boots were scuffed, and his hair was neatly trimmed but unremarkable. He looked like just another trucker passing through a man on the road, stopping for a quick meal before continuing his journey. But there was something about Sam that didn't quite fit the image. While most truckers leaned back in their seats or struck up conversations with anyone willing to listen, Sam sat upright, his back straight, his shoulders relaxed in a way that felt almost too deliberate. He stirred his coffee slowly, his gaze fixed on the window. Outside, the empty highway stretched into the distance, and beyond it, fields of golden grass swayed gently in the breeze. But Sam wasn't really looking at the road or the fields. His eyes had a faraway look, as if he were watching something from his past instead of the present. He took a sip of his coffee, his movements slow and deliberate, and set the mug back down with a soft clink. His hands, calloused and strong, rested on the table. There was no phone in his hand, no book to read, no distraction of any kind. He was simply there, present in a way that most people weren't anymore. And while the other customers came and went, chatting about their plans or the weather, Sam sat in silence, as still as a statue. The bell above the door jingled, breaking the quiet rhythm of the diner. The sound was sharp, almost jarring, and it made a few heads turn. A group of bikers walked in, 6 of them in total. They filled the doorway, their leather jackets and heavy boots giving them an imposing presence. Tattoos covered their arms and necks, and their faces wore cocky grins that seemed to challenge anyone to say something. One of them, a tall man with a shaved head and a jagged scar running down his cheek, led the group. He scanned the room with a smirk, his sharp eyes taking in the handful of customers scattered around the diner. Behind him, the others chuckled and elbowed each other, their laughter loud and rough. The leader sauntered up to the counter and leaned against it, looking down at the cook. "Hey, old man," he barked, his voice loud enough to echo off the walls. "Got anything stronger than this dishwater coffee you're serving?" The cook, unfazed, flipped another pancake and glanced up. "Coffee's all we've got," he said calmly, his tone making it clear he wasn't interested in any trouble. The biker snorted and shook his head. "Figures. What kind of dump doesn't even have a decent drink?" His friends laughed behind him, the sound grating against the otherwise peaceful atmosphere. Doris, ever the professional, approached the group with her coffee pot in hand. "I can get you boys a fresh pot," she offered with a smile, her voice kind but firm. "Why don't you take a seat and I'll be right with you?" The leader turned to her, his smirk widening. "Sure thing, sweetheart. But make it quick. We're thirsty." The group claimed 2 booths near the center of the diner, shoving the tables together and taking up more space than they needed. Their voices were loud, their laughter louder, and the other customers quickly took the hint. One by one, they paid their bills and left, casting wary glances at the bikers on their way out. But Sam stayed. He didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even glance their way. He stirred his coffee once more, the sound of the spoon against the ceramic mug barely audible over the bikers' chatter. It was as if they didn't exist to him. But they did. One of the bikers, a wiry man with a snake tattoo coiling around his neck, noticed Sam sitting alone. He nudged the guy next to him and pointed with his chin. "Hey, check out the loner over there," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. The leader turned his head, his smirk faltering for just a moment as he sized up the man in the corner. "Huh. Looks like he didn't get the memo. This is our place now." Snake Tattoo grinned. "Let's see if he's as quiet as he looks." The leader raised a hand, stopping him. "Not yet. Let him sit for a while. Maybe he'll get the message on his own." The group laughed again, their voices filling the small diner as they settled in, but Sam didn't react. He took another sip of his coffee, his expression calm, almost bored. Doris glanced at him from across the room, her kind eyes filled with a mix of apology and concern. She had seen men like the bikers before, and she knew their type. They thrived on intimidation, on pushing people around just because they could. But Sam wasn't like the others who had hurried out the door. He stayed. And something about the way he stayed made Doris pause. Sam might have looked like just another drifter passing through, but there was something in his stillness, in the way he carried himself, that didn't fit. Most people, when confronted with a group like this, would have at least glanced their way, shown some sign of discomfort or unease. But Sam didn't. He just kept staring out the window, as if nothing in the world could bother him. The bikers continued their loud banter, their laughter grating against the quiet hum of the diner's ceiling fan. They didn't know it yet, but the man they had dismissed as a nobody was far more than he seemed. Sam had heard every word, felt every sneering glance sent his way. He just didn't care. Not yet. The bikers dominated the room with their presence. They weren't just loud, they were obnoxious, leaning back in their chairs like they owned the place, talking over one another, and making crude jokes that left Doris rolling her eyes as she tried to focus on her work. Every clink of their silverware against the plate seemed louder than it needed to be, every laugh sharper, designed to draw attention. Snake Tattoo leaned back in his chair, balancing it precariously on two legs as he watched Doris. "Hey, sweetheart," he called out, his voice dripping with mock charm, "what's a gal like you doing in a dump like this?" Doris didn't answer immediately. Instead, she calmly refilled the coffee pot, her lips pressed into a thin line. When she finally turned to him, her voice was even but firm. "Just doing my job, same as you should let me do mine." The bikers roared with laughter, Snake Tattoo included. "Feisty one, huh? I like that," he said, winking at her. The leader of the group, the one with the scar, didn't laugh. Instead, he kept his eyes on Doris as if sizing her up. His gaze was sharp and calculating, different from his friend's carefree rowdiness. He didn't care about the small talk or the jokes. He was watching, waiting, looking for something or someone to challenge him. In the corner, Sam lifted his coffee mug to his lips and took another sip, his movements deliberate, calm, and unhurried. It wasn't that he didn't notice the bikers or their antics. He noticed everything. The way the leader's eyes scanned the room, the way Snake Tattoo's laughter was just a little too forced, the way Doris's hands trembled slightly as she carried a tray back to the counter. Sam saw it all, but he remained still. The bikers weren't the first men like this he'd come across, and they wouldn't be the last. Bullies were predictable, almost boring in their behavior. They strutted around, puffed out their chests, and acted like they were the kings of the world until someone or something knocked them off their pedestal. And Sam had been the one to knock more than a few off their pedestals in his time. But not yet. Not here. For now, he stayed seated, his focus outwardly on the window. The road stretched out endlessly, shimmering slightly in the afternoon heat. The fields on either side seemed to ripple like waves in the breeze, a peaceful contrast to the tension building inside the diner. "Hey, Doris," one of the bikers called out, slamming his fist on the table to get her attention. "How about another round of coffee over here? You're moving like molasses." Doris glanced at him and gave a tight smile. "I'll get to it when I can." The biker scoffed and muttered something under his breath, but Doris ignored him, turning back to the counter. She could feel their eyes on her as she moved, and it made her skin crawl. Snake Tattoo nudged the man beside him, jerking his thumb toward Sam. "What's the deal with Quiet Boy over there? He lose his tongue or something?" The leader didn't even turn his head. "Doesn't matter. He'll leave soon enough." But Snake Tattoo wasn't convinced. He leaned forward, squinting at Sam. "Nah, something's off about him. Look at the way he's sitting. Too straight. Too stiff. Like he's waiting for something." The man next to him laughed. "Yeah, maybe he's waiting for his grandma to pick him up." More laughter followed, but Sam didn't react. He stirred his coffee slowly, the spoon clinking softly against the mug, his eyes still fixed on the horizon. Doris glanced at him again, her concern growing. She didn't know much about Sam. He'd come in a few times before, always alone, always quiet. But there was something about him that unsettled her, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. He wasn't rude or unfriendly, just different. He moved like someone who was used to being in control, someone who was always aware of his surroundings. And the way he seemed to completely ignore the bikers, it wasn't the nervous kind of ignoring that most people did when they were afraid. It was purposeful, deliberate, like he was waiting for something to happen. And that made Doris nervous. "Hey." Snake Tattoo's voice cut through the room, louder this time. "I'm talking to you, Quiet Boy." This time, the leader looked up, a hint of irritation crossing his face. "Leave him alone," he said, his tone sharp. "We're here to relax, not pick fights." But Snake Tattoo ignored him. "Come on, man, don't be like that. I just want to know why our friend over there thinks he's too good to talk to us." The leader sighed and leaned back in his chair, waving a hand dismissively. "Do what you want, but don't come crying to me if he cracks your skull." The others laughed, but Snake Tattoo didn't seem to find it funny. He pushed his chair back and stood, his boots thudding against the linoleum floor as he crossed the room. Doris froze, her heart pounding as she watched him approach Sam's table. "Don't," she said softly, but Snake Tattoo ignored her. He stopped just a foot away from Sam's table, crossing his arms and tilting his head to the side. "Hey there, pal," he said, his voice dripping with mock friendliness. "You look awfully lonely sitting over here all by yourself. Why don't you come join us? We'll even buy you a coffee." Sam didn't look up. Snake Tattoo's grin faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered, leaning closer. "What's the matter? You too good to talk to me? Or are you just scared?" The room seemed to hold its breath. Doris stood frozen behind the counter, her fingers gripping the edge so tightly her knuckles turned white. The cook stopped flipping pancakes, his spatula hovering mid-air as he watched the scene unfold. But Sam didn't move. Didn't flinch. Didn't even blink. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and calm. "Just passing through." Snake Tattoo laughed, but it was a hollow, uneasy sound. "Passing through, huh? Well, maybe you should pass through a little faster. This is our spot, and we don't take kindly to people who don't show a little respect." Sam's hand tightened around his coffee mug, just for a moment, but his expression didn't change. He set the mug down slowly, deliberately, the soft clink of ceramic on wood echoing in the otherwise silent room. "I don't want any trouble," he said, his tone even, almost bored. Snake Tattoo leaned in closer, his grin returning. "Well, that's too bad," he said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Because trouble's exactly what you're gonna get." The tension in the room was so thick it was almost suffocating. Doris wanted to intervene, to say something, but her instincts told her that whatever was about to happen was beyond her control. Sam remained still, his gaze steady and unflinching as he looked at Snake Tattoo for the first time. And for a brief moment, something flickered in his eyes, something cold and unyielding, like the calm before a storm. The leader of the bikers watched from his seat, his smirk fading slightly as he observed the interaction. "Hey, Snake," he called out, his voice carrying a note of warning. "Let it go. He's not worth it." But Snake Tattoo wasn't listening. He was too caught up in the moment, too focused on proving himself. "Come on, quiet boy," he taunted, his voice rising. "Show me what you've got." Sam's expression didn't change. "I'd rather not." The simple statement hung in the air, heavy with meaning. And in that moment, Doris knew something was about to happen. The tension in the diner thickened like smoke, hanging heavy in the air. The other bikers chuckled at Snake Tattoo's mockery, egging him on with jeers and exaggerated laughs. They loved a good show, and right now, Snake Tattoo had made Sam the star of this one. Sam didn't answer immediately. He didn't flinch, didn't bristle, didn't rise to the bait. He simply sat there, as calm as a still lake before a storm. His eyes met Snake Tattoo's with a quiet intensity, not angry or scared, just focused. Snake Tattoo didn't like that look. It wasn't the reaction he wanted. Most people would have stammered, gotten defensive, or tried to back down by now. But this guy? He was just sitting there. Calm, quiet, and completely unshaken. Snake Tattoo leaned even closer, planting both hands on the table. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" he spat. "Sitting there all cool like you don't have a care in the world." Sam tilted his head slightly, studying the man in front of him like he was trying to solve a puzzle. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured and calm. "No. I don't think about you at all." The room went silent for a beat. The air seemed to freeze as those words hung between them, sharp and deliberate. The bikers burst out laughing, but this time, it wasn't the kind of laughter Snake Tattoo wanted. It was laughter at him, not with him. "Oh man," one of them guffawed, slapping his knee. "He's got you there, Snake." Snake Tattoo's face darkened, his grin twisting into a snarl. He grabbed Sam's coffee cup, still half full, and flung it across the room. It shattered against the wall, the dark liquid dripping down like muddy rain. "You got a smart mouth, old man," Snake growled. "Maybe I should shut it for you." The waitress, Doris, froze mid-step, her tray wobbling in her hands. "Hey," she shouted, her voice trembling but brave. "That's enough. You're scaring the customers." The leader of the bikers, a tall man with a jagged scar running down his cheek, waved a hand lazily from his seat. "Let him blow off some steam, Doris. Snake's just having a little fun." "Fun?" Doris snapped, her voice rising. "This isn't fun. You're harassing my customer." The leader turned his sharp eyes on her, and for a moment, Doris faltered under his gaze. He didn't need to yell or snarl like Snake, his quiet menace was enough. "Mind your business, Doris," he said evenly. "We'll be done when we're done." Doris swallowed hard, her hands trembling. She looked at Sam, silently pleading for him to do something, say something, anything to defuse the situation. But Sam just sat there, still calm, still quiet. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a crumpled napkin, and wiped a small splash of coffee off the table. The movement was so mundane, so deliberate, it was almost insulting. Snake Tattoo wasn't done. He grabbed the edge of Sam's table and gave it a hard shove, knocking over the sugar dispenser and sending the napkin holder clattering to the floor. "What's the matter?" he taunted. "Not so cool now, huh?" Sam sighed softly, like a man who'd just been handed an annoyance he didn't have time for. He stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the linoleum floor. He was taller than he looked sitting down, his broad shoulders casting a shadow over Snake Tattoo. The laughter from the other bikers died down, replaced by a cautious silence. They were rowdy, sure, but they weren't stupid. There was something about the way Sam moved controlled, deliberate, like every step and gesture had been practiced 1,000 times. Snake Tattoo took a step back, but he quickly masked his hesitation with bravado. "Oh, you think you're tough now, huh?" Big man standing up. Sam didn't respond. He simply stared at Snake Tattoo, his expression calm but unyielding. The air around him seemed to shift, growing heavier, as if the weight of his presence alone was enough to make everyone take notice. The leader of the bikers frowned, sitting up straighter in his seat. "Snake," he said sharply, his tone carrying an edge of warning. But Snake Tattoo wasn't listening. Embarrassed and desperate to save face, he lunged forward, shoving Sam with both hands. It was a mistake. Sam didn't stumble or flinch. Instead, he moved with an almost inhuman speed, catching Snake Tattoo's wrists before they even made contact with his chest. He twisted them just enough to make the biker cry out in pain, not enough to break, but enough to show he could if he wanted to. The diner erupted in chaos. Chairs scraped against the floor as the other bikers jumped to their feet. Doris gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. But Sam didn't even glance at the others. His focus was entirely on Snake Tattoo, who was now grimacing, his cocky demeanor crumbling. "Sit down," Sam said quietly, his voice as steady as ever. Snake Tattoo tried to pull away, but Sam's grip was unrelenting. It wasn't just strength, it was precision, the kind of control that came from years of training. "Let me go." Snake snarled, but there was a tremor in his voice now. Sam's gaze didn't waver. "I don't want to hurt you," he said, his tone almost apologetic. "But if you push me, I will." For a moment, it seemed like Snake might argue. But then he looked into Sam's eyes, those cold, unflinching eyes, and realized he was out of his depth. Sam released him, and Snake stumbled back, rubbing his wrists and glaring daggers at the older man. "You're dead," he hissed. "You hear me? Dead." The leader of the bikers stepped forward, his expression unreadable. He placed a hand on Snake's shoulder, forcing him back. "That's enough," he said firmly. Snake Tattoo hesitated, his pride clearly wounded, but he eventually nodded and slunk back to the table. The leader turned to Sam, his sharp eyes studying him carefully. "You've got some moves, old man," he said, his tone more respectful than mocking. "What's your story?" Sam didn't answer. He simply picked up his chair, set it back in place, and sat down. "Just passing through," he said again, his voice calm and measured. The leader smirked, but there was no humor in it. "Well, maybe you should keep passing through. Some places aren't as friendly as this one." Sam didn't respond. He picked up his fork, speared a piece of pie, and took a bite, as if the entire exchange had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience. The bikers returned to their table, though their earlier bravado had dimmed. The air in the diner remained heavy, the unspoken tension thick and oppressive. Doris stood frozen behind the counter, her eyes darting nervously between Sam and the group. For now, the storm had passed. But everyone in the room knew it wasn't over. The room settled into an uneasy quiet, though it was a quiet full of unsaid words and unspoken threats. The bikers muttered among themselves, throwing occasional glances toward Sam. Snake Tattoo sat fuming, his hands curled into fists on the table, his pride still stinging from the confrontation. Doris, clutching her tray tightly, hesitated before approaching Sam's table. "You okay?" she whispered, her voice low enough that the bikers wouldn't hear. Sam nodded, his calm demeanor unwavering. "Just fine." "You sure? You could leave now before things get worse." Her eyes darted toward the bikers, her fear evident. Sam gave her a small, reassuring smile. "I've dealt with worse." Doris wanted to press further, but something in his tone steady, unshakable made her stop. She nodded reluctantly and stepped back, casting one last worried glance over her shoulder before returning to the counter. The bikers weren't done watching Sam. The leader, Scar, leaned back in his chair, swirling his beer bottle idly as he studied him. "You don't scare easy, do you?" he called out, his voice carrying across the room. Sam didn't look up from his pie. "Not much to be scared of," he said simply, his tone as calm as ever. The remark drew a few laughs from the bikers, though Scar didn't join in. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "See, that's what I don't get. Most people would have been out the door by now. But you're just sitting there like nothing happened. Makes me wonder who you really are." Sam set his fork down and met Scar's gaze for the first time. "Just a guy passing through," he said, his voice firm but unprovocative. Scar's eyes narrowed, the smirk fading from his face. "No, you're not. Guys just passing through don't put Snake in his place without breaking a sweat. So, what's your deal? Ex-cop? Retired military?" The diner went still again, the tension building once more. Even the waitress paused in her movements, her hands hovering over the coffee pot as she listened. Sam didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "I'm nobody you need to worry about," he said finally, his tone carrying just a hint of warning. Scar's smirk returned, but this time, it was colder. "See, that's the thing. When someone says they're nobody, it usually means they're hiding something." The other bikers chuckled nervously, their bravado starting to return. Snake Tattoo, emboldened by Scar's lead, sneered at Sam. "Maybe he's just scared to tell us the truth. Probably some washed-up old vet who thinks he's still tough." Sam's eyes flicked to Snake Tattoo, his expression as calm as ever. "You sure talk a lot for someone who just got put in his place." The room erupted into laughter again, but this time, it was louder, sharper. Even a couple of the bikers couldn't hold back their snickers. Snake Tattoo's face flushed red, his hands slamming down on the table. "That's it," he growled, pushing his chair back with a screech. He stood up, fists clenched, and started toward Sam's table. Scar held up a hand, stopping him in his tracks. "Sit down, Snake." "But..." "Sit down." Snake hesitated for a moment, his jaw working furiously as he struggled to contain his anger. Finally, he slumped back into his chair, glaring daggers at Sam. Scar turned his attention back to Sam, his smirk gone. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But guts only get you so far." Sam didn't respond, didn't flinch. He just picked up his fork and took another bite of pie, as if the conversation didn't matter in the slightest. The bikers didn't like that. They thrived on intimidation, on fear. And Sam's calm indifference was like a slap in the face. Scar leaned back again, his fingers drumming on the table. "You're making this real hard, you know that. We could have let it go. Could have left you alone. But now you've got us curious." Sam set his fork down again, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked at Scar, his gaze steady and unyielding. "Curiosity can be dangerous," he said softly. Scar chuckled, though there was no humor in the sound. "Dangerous, huh? You threatening me, old man?" "No, Sam said, his voice steady. Just a warning. The tension in the room was almost unbearable now, the kind of tension that made your heart pound and your breath catch in your throat. Everyone was waiting to see who would make the next move, who would break the fragile calm. Doris, desperate to defuse the situation, stepped forward with a fresh pot of coffee. "How about I get you boys another round on the house," she said, her voice overly cheerful. Scar glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "That's real nice of you, Doris," he said finally, his tone almost pleasant. "But I think we're good for now." He turned back to Sam, his eyes narrowing. "We're not done here, though. Not by a long shot." Sam didn't respond. He just picked up his coffee mug, now empty, and held it out to Doris. "Refill, please." Doris hesitated for a moment, then nodded and quickly poured him another cup. Her hands were trembling, but she forced a smile. Scar watched the exchange, his smirk returning. "Enjoy your coffee, old man," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "You might not get another chance." The bikers laughed, their voices loud and grating. But Sam didn't even blink. He simply took a sip of his coffee, his expression as calm and steady as ever. The bikers eventually settled back into their seats, though the tension in the air didn't fade. They were planning something. It was obvious in the way they whispered among themselves, in the occasional glances they threw Sam's way. Sam knew it, too. But he didn't seem worried. If anything, he looked prepared. And that, more than anything, unsettled them. The hours dragged on, the sun dipping lower in the sky and casting long shadows across the diner. Most of the other customers had left, leaving just Sam, the bikers, and Doris. Doris busied herself behind the counter, her hands trembling as she wiped down the already clean surface. She kept glancing at Sam, silently pleading with him to leave, to avoid whatever was coming. But Sam stayed. And the bikers waited. It was a standoff, silent and unspoken, but undeniable. Snake Tattoo, still nursing his bruised pride, finally broke the silence. "You think you're tough, don't you?" he sneered, leaning forward on his elbows. Sam didn't answer. "I asked you a question, old man," Snake pressed, his voice louder now. Sam set his coffee mug down and looked at him, his expression calm but unyielding. "I don't need to think it," he said quietly. The room went still again, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. Scar's smirk returned, but it was colder now, more calculating. "You've got a real attitude problem, you know that." Sam didn't respond. Scar leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "We'll see how tough you are when things get serious." Sam's gaze didn't waver. "Whenever you're ready." The challenge hung between them, undeniable and impossible to ignore. Doris's voice broke the silence, trembling but brave. "Please, don't do this," she said, her eyes darting between Sam and the bikers. "Just let him go." Scar glanced at her, his smirk widening. "Oh, don't worry, Doris. We're just getting to know our new friend here." But everyone in the room knew it was more than that. Much more. Snake Tattoo laughed again, his bravado bolstered by the jeers of his crew. He leaned closer to Sam, his fork still embedded in the table. "You think you're too good to answer us? Too good for a little fun?" Sam ignored him, picking up his coffee mug and taking a slow sip. The calmness of the gesture only seemed to aggravate the bikers further. Scar, who had been silently watching from his seat, leaned forward, his chair creaking under his weight. "Snake, you're wasting your breath," Scar said, his voice low but carrying an edge. "This guy thinks he's untouchable. Maybe we need to remind him whose turf he's on." Scar's words carried a threat, and the room seemed to grow smaller, the air thicker with tension. Doris froze mid-step, clutching a tray of plates. Her eyes darted to Sam, silently begging him to walk away, to do anything to defuse the situation. But Sam remained still, his expression unreadable. Snake Tattoo smirked, encouraged by his leader's approval. He yanked the fork out of the table and waved it in front of Sam's face. "What do you say, old man? Ready to play nice?" Sam's gaze shifted to the fork, then back to Snake's face. "Put it down," he said quietly. The words were calm, almost casual, but they hit like a sledgehammer. The laughter died away as the bikers exchanged uneasy glances. There was something in Sam's tone, something cold and unshakable that they couldn't ignore. Snake, however, wasn't one to back down. He laughed nervously and pointed the fork closer. "Or what? You gonna show me how tough you are?" Sam didn't respond immediately. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his eyes locking onto Snake's with a piercing intensity. "Or you'll regret it," he said, his voice as steady as a rock. For a moment, it was as if the whole diner held its breath. Even Scar seemed caught off guard by the weight of Sam's words. Snake hesitated, his bravado faltering. But pride and the watchful eyes of his crew spurred him on. He slammed the fork down on the table and leaned in close. "You don't scare me," he growled. But before he could say anything else, the cook spoke up, his voice trembling but firm. "That's enough." All eyes turned to the cook, who was gripping the edge of the counter so tightly that his knuckles were white. "Leave him alone. You don't know who you're messing with." Scar raised an eyebrow, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "And who, exactly, are we messing with?" The cook hesitated, his gaze flickering to Sam, who gave him a subtle shake of his head. The cook swallowed hard and stepped back, realizing he'd said too much. But the damage was done. The bikers were intrigued. Scar's smirk widened as he turned back to Sam. Well. Looks like our quiet friend here has a secret. Care to share?" Sam didn't respond. He simply picked up his coffee mug and took another sip, his eyes never leaving Scar's. Scar chuckled and leaned back in his chair. "Fine. Keep your secrets. But don't think that means you're off the hook." The bikers laughed, their confidence returning. But their bravado couldn't mask the unease that had settled over the room. Something about Sam didn't add up, and it was starting to get under their skin. The minutes ticked by, the tension in the diner growing heavier with each passing second. Sam remained calm, his movements deliberate and unhurried. But the bikers weren't done. They whispered among themselves, their eyes darting toward Sam as they plotted their next move. Doris, unable to bear the silence any longer, approached Sam's table. She placed a fresh pot of coffee on the table, her hands shaking. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Just leave. They won't let this go." Sam looked up at her, his expression softening slightly. "I appreciate your concern," he said quietly. "But I'm not leaving." Doris bit her lip, her eyes glistening with tears. "You don't understand. They're dangerous." Sam gave her a small, reassuring smile. "So am I." The words were spoken so softly that only Doris could hear them. Her eyes widened, and she stepped back, her mind racing. Who was this man? And why did he seem so unafraid? The bikers, oblivious to the exchange, continued their murmured conversation. Finally, Scar stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. He walked over to Sam's table, his crew following close behind. "You've got a lot of nerve, sitting here like you own the place," Scar said, crossing his arms over his chest. "But I think it's time we showed you how things work around here." Sam set his coffee mug down and looked up at Scar, his expression calm but unyielding. "Is that so?" Scar's smirk faded, replaced by a cold, calculating glare. "Yeah, that's so." The other bikers closed in, surrounding Sam's table. Snake Tattoo cracked his knuckles, his grin returning. "Let's see how tough you really are, old man." Sam didn't flinch. He didn't move. He simply looked at each of them in turn, his gaze steady and unshakable. "You don't want to do this," he said, his voice low and firm. Scar chuckled, though the sound lacked humor. "And why's that?" Sam leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking onto Scar's. "Because I won't stop." The words sent a chill through the room. The bikers hesitated, their confidence wavering. For the first time, they realized that Sam wasn't bluffing. There was something in his eyes, something cold and unrelenting that made them second-guess themselves. But pride and the watchful eyes of their leader kept them from backing down. Scar stepped closer, his jaw tightening. Big talk for a guy sitting all alone. Sam didn't respond. He simply sat back in his chair, his calm demeanor as unnerving as ever. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, their bravado starting to crack. But Scar wasn't ready to back down. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a low growl. "Let's see if you're as tough as you think you are." Sam's hand tightened around his coffee mug, his knuckles whitening. But before he could say anything, the bell above the diner door jingled, drawing everyone's attention. A man walked in, his presence commanding and authoritative. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with sharp features and a no-nonsense demeanor. He wore a sheriff's badge on his chest, and his eyes immediately locked onto the bikers. "What's going on here?" the sheriff demanded, his voice firm. The bikers stepped back, their confidence faltering under the sheriff's scrutiny. Scar forced a grin, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Just having a little chat, Sheriff. No harm done." The sheriff's eyes narrowed, his gaze shifting to Sam. "You all right, sir?" Sam nodded, his expression calm. "Just fine." The sheriff looked back at the bikers, his expression hardening. "Well, you've had your fun. Time to move along." Scar hesitated, his jaw tightening. But he knew better than to push his luck with the law. With a reluctant nod, he motioned for his crew to follow him. "Come on, boys. Let's go." The bikers filed out of the diner, their laughter forced and hollow. But as Scar passed Sam's table, he leaned in close, his voice a low whisper. "This isn't over." Sam didn't respond. He simply watched as the bikers disappeared into the night, their motorcycles roaring to life. The sheriff lingered for a moment, his eyes lingering on Sam. "You sure you're all right?" Sam nodded again. "I'm sure." The sheriff studied him for a moment longer, then nodded and turned to leave. But as he walked out the door, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Sam than met the eye. Back in the diner, Doris approached Sam's table, her expression a mix of relief and curiosity. "Who are you?" she asked softly. Sam picked up his coffee mug, his gaze distant. "Just a guy passing through." But as he took a sip, the faintest hint of a smile tugged at the corners of his lips. Because he knew the truth that the bikers had no idea what they had just walked away from. And that they wouldn't stop until they found out. As the sheriff's car disappeared down the highway, the low rumble of the bikers' motorcycles faded into the night. The diner grew eerily quiet, the tension still lingering like smoke after a fire. Doris stood by the counter, her hands trembling as she poured herself a cup of coffee. The cook leaned on the counter, his eyes fixed on Sam, who hadn't moved from his seat. "Are you really okay?" Doris asked again, her voice barely above a whisper. Sam set his coffee mug down, the faint clink breaking the silence. He nodded, offering her a reassuring glance. "I'm fine." But his calm didn't ease her nerves. Doris wasn't sure what had just happened, but she knew one thing: Sam wasn't ordinary. She had seen plenty of drifters pass through over the years, but none had carried themselves like him. His stillness wasn't the kind that came from fear or submission. It was the kind that came from experience, deep, unsettling experience. Those guys, they're going to come back, the cook said, his voice rough. Scar doesn't let things go. I know, Sam replied simply, his voice steady. The cook frowned. You should leave before they do. You don't know what they're capable of. Sam glanced at him, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. And they don't know what I'm capable of. The cook stiffened, his earlier suspicion now solidified. He wiped his hands on his apron and leaned in closer. That tattoo on your wrist. Special Forces, right? Sam didn't answer immediately. Instead, he rolled his sleeve back down, covering the mark. His gaze met the cook's, and for a moment, there was a silent understanding between them. Used to be, Sam admitted finally, his voice quiet but firm. The cook's eyes widened slightly. Well, that explains a lot. But that doesn't mean you should stick around and take on a gang of bikers. Sam chuckled softly, the sound low and almost inaudible. You don't need to worry about me. Doris, still clutching her coffee, shook her head. It's not about you. It's about this place, about us. If they come back and you're here, it's only going to get worse. Sam's gaze softened. He could see the fear in her eyes, the concern etched into her face. She wasn't wrong. The bikers would return, and they wouldn't come back just to talk. But running wasn't in Sam's nature. He had spent years running from war, from memories, from himself. And now, he was tired of it. I'll handle it, he said finally. Doris blinked, her brow furrowing. Handle it? You can't just. I'll make sure they don't bother you again, Sam interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. The cook opened his mouth to protest, but the words caught in his throat. There was something about the way Sam spoke, a quiet confidence that made it impossible to doubt him. Still, the thought of what would happen if the bikers came back made his stomach churn. Meanwhile, a few miles down the road, the bikers had pulled into a rundown gas station. The neon sign flickered above them as they leaned against their bikes, smoking and laughing. But the laughter was hollow, forced. Scar stood apart from the group, his hands clenched into fists. Snake Tattoo approached him, his smirk still plastered on his face. You really gonna let that old guy get away with mouthing off to us? Scar didn't answer right away. He stared out at the dark highway, his jaw tight. Finally, he spoke. No. We're not letting this go. Snake grinned, his eagerness palpable. Good. I say we head back there and teach him a lesson he won't forget. Scar turned to face him, his eyes cold. Not yet. We need to be smart about this. That sheriff might be keeping an eye on the place. Snake frowned, clearly disappointed. So what's the plan? Scar took a long drag of his cigarette, exhaling slowly. We wait. We watch. And when the time's right, we'll make our move. The other bikers murmured their agreement, their bravado returning. But underneath their cocky grins, there was a flicker of unease. They couldn't shake the way Sam had looked at them, the calm certainty in his eyes. It wasn't the look of a man who was afraid. It was the look of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. Back at the diner, the hours dragged on. Most of the customers had left, leaving the place eerily quiet. Doris wiped down the counter, her hands still trembling slightly. The cook had retreated to the kitchen, his way of avoiding the tension that hung in the air. Sam remained in his booth, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. He scanned the room, taking in every detail: the position of the chairs, the angle of the windows, the weight of the air. Years of training had honed his instincts, and they were screaming at him now. Trouble was coming. It was only a matter of time. Doris finally worked up the courage to approach him again. You're really not leaving, are you? Sam looked up at her, his expression unreadable. No. She sighed, frustration mingling with fear. Why? Why stay and risk getting hurt or worse? You don't even know us. Sam considered her words for a moment before responding. Because I've spent too long running. And sometimes, you have to stand your ground. Doris didn't know how to respond to that. She could see the resolve in his eyes, the weight of whatever had brought him to this point. She didn't understand it, but she couldn't deny it either. Hours passed. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, the only sound in the otherwise silent diner. Sam stayed where he was, his coffee long gone but his focus unbroken. Doris and the cook exchanged worried glances, their unease growing with each passing minute. And then, the faint roar of motorcycles shattered the stillness. Doris froze, her eyes widening in fear. The cook stepped out from the kitchen, his face pale. "They're back," he muttered. Sam stood slowly, his movements deliberate. He adjusted his jacket and glanced at Doris. "Stay behind the counter. Keep your head down." But she started to protest, but Sam's firm gaze stopped her. "Stay behind the counter," he repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. The roar of the motorcycles grew louder, closer. Doris and the cook ducked behind the counter, their hearts pounding. Sam moved to the middle of the diner, his posture calm but his eyes sharp. The bell above the door jingled as the bikers stormed in, their boots thudding heavily against the floor. Scar was at the front, his expression cold and calculating. "We're back," Scar said, his voice low and menacing. "Miss us?" Sam didn't answer. He stood his ground, his gaze locked on Scar's. Scar smirked, his crew spreading out behind him. "You had your chance to walk away, old man. But now, you're going to regret sticking around." Sam's lips curved into a faint smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "We'll see." And in that moment, the atmosphere in the diner shifted. The bikers, so sure of their dominance, suddenly found themselves hesitating. Because despite their numbers, despite their bravado, they couldn't shake the feeling that they had just made a very big mistake. Scar's boots thudded heavily as he stepped forward, his face a mask of fury. He towered over the groaning bikers sprawled across the diner floor, his fists clenched so tight the leather of his gloves creaked. "Who the hell are you?" he growled, his voice low and venomous. Sam didn't answer immediately. He crouched down to pick up the knife the other biker had dropped, inspecting it casually as if it were a trivial thing. Then he straightened, tossing it onto the counter without a care. His calm demeanor seemed to infuriate Scar even more. "I'm just a guy passing through," Sam said at last, his tone even and unbothered. "But I told you I don't want trouble. You're the ones who couldn't leave well enough alone." Scar snorted, his face twisting into a sneer. "Passing through? Don't give me that crap. Nobody fights like you do unless they've seen things. Done things." Sam's jaw tightened slightly, but he said nothing. Scar glanced at Snake Tattoo, who was still cradling his arm, and then at the rest of his gang, who were too dazed or winded to stand. "You've got a lot of nerve," Scar said, taking another step closer. "But don't think for a second you've won. This isn't over." The cook, still peering nervously from behind the counter, muttered under his breath, "It should be over. If they had any sense, they'd leave now." Doris clutched the edge of the counter, her knuckles white. "Sam, please. Just let them go. Let them leave." Sam turned his head slightly, giving Doris a small nod of reassurance. Then he looked back at Scar, his expression unreadable. "If you're smart," he said, "you'll take your guys and go. Now." Scar laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "You think you scare me? You think you're some kind of big shot tough guy?" Sam tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady. "I don't think anything. I just know what I'm capable of." Scar's grin faltered, just for a moment. But his pride and his rage were stronger. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a steel chain that clinked ominously as he wrapped it around his fist. "Let's see what you're capable of, then." The tension in the diner became unbearable, like the air itself was holding its breath. Scar swung the chain, the heavy steel cutting through the air with a sharp whip. Sam didn't flinch. He sidestepped the first strike, his movements precise and deliberate, and before Scar could react, Sam grabbed the chain, twisting it with a sharp jerk that sent Scar stumbling forward. Scar growled and swung again, his strikes wild but powerful. Sam dodged with ease, his movements almost lazy, as if he were more bored than threatened. When Scar lunged, Sam stepped to the side, using the man's momentum to shove him into a table. The crash echoed through the room. "Stay down," Sam said, his tone more of a suggestion than a command. But Scar wasn't listening. He scrambled to his feet, his face red with humiliation and fury. "You think you're better than me," he snarled. "You think you can just walk in here and—" Before he could finish, Sam moved again, faster than anyone expected. He closed the distance between them in an instant, grabbing Scar's arm and twisting it behind his back. Scar shouted in pain as Sam pushed him to the floor, his knee pressing firmly between Scar's shoulder blades. "It's not about being better," Sam said, his voice calm but unyielding. "It's about knowing when to walk away." Scar struggled, but it was useless. Sam's grip was unbreakable. The other bikers watched in stunned silence, too afraid to intervene. The diner door creaked open. Everyone turned to see the sheriff standing in the doorway, his hand resting on his holstered gun. His eyes scanned the scene: the overturned tables, the groaning bikers, and Sam calmly pinning Scar to the ground. "Well, I'll be," the sheriff said, stepping inside. "Looks like I got here just in time." Sam released Scar, standing up and stepping back. Scar scrambled to his feet, glaring at Sam with a mixture of hatred and fear. "These guys bothering you, Doris?" the sheriff asked, his tone casual but laced with authority. Doris nodded quickly. They were, but Sam she gestured to the scene, struggling to find the words. "He handled it?" The sheriff raised an eyebrow, looking at Sam. "Handled it, huh?" Sam shrugged. "They wouldn't listen." Scar opened his mouth to protest, but the sheriff cut him off. "I think it's time you and your boys left town," he said firmly, his hand still resting on his gun. "And if I see you around here again, we're gonna have a very different kind of conversation. Got it?" Scar clenched his fists, his face twisted in anger. But the sheriff's steely gaze and the memory of what Sam had just done left him with no choice. He spat on the floor and motioned for his gang to follow him. "This isn't over," Scar muttered as he walked past Sam. Sam didn't respond. He simply watched as the bikers limped out of the diner, their bravado shattered. The roar of their motorcycles faded into the distance, leaving behind an uneasy silence. As the sheriff wrote up a report, Doris approached Sam cautiously. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft. Sam nodded. "I'm fine." The cook emerged from the kitchen, shaking his head in disbelief. "That was something. I've never seen anyone move like that." "Who are you, really?" Sam hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. For a moment, it seemed like he wasn't going to answer. But then he looked up, his expression calm but tired. "I used to be someone else," he said quietly. "Someone who did things I'm not proud of. But that was a long time ago." Doris and the cook exchanged a glance, their curiosity burning. But they could see the weight in Sam's eyes, the scars of a past he wasn't eager to revisit. "Well," Doris said finally, offering a small smile. "Whatever you used to be, you saved us today. Thank you." Sam gave her a faint smile in return, but he didn't say anything. He picked up his jacket and walked to the door, pausing for a moment before stepping outside. The sheriff watched him go, a thoughtful expression on his face. You know, he said, turning to Doris, a guy like that doesn't just wander through for no reason. He's running from something. Maybe, Doris replied, her gaze following Sam as he disappeared into the night. Or maybe he's just looking for a place to stop running. The sheriff watched the tail lights of Sam's truck fade into the night, his brow furrowed with curiosity. A man like that doesn't just show up in a place like this by accident, he murmured to Doris as he finished his notes. Doris sighed, leaning against the counter. You saw the way he handled those bikers. He's not some drifter. He's something else. But whatever he is, he saved us. That's all I care about. The sheriff adjusted his hat, his eyes still fixed on the road. You should care about more than that, Doris. A man like him could be running from trouble or dragging it behind him. Inside the diner, the aftermath was starting to settle. Chairs were slowly righted, and the cook nervously swept up broken glass. The few remaining customers whispered to each other, their voices hushed with awe and fear. But for Doris, there was something calming about Sam. Even as chaos raged, his stillness and control had been a comfort. She felt a pang of regret as she thought about him driving off alone. What's his story, she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. Sam drove in silence, the hum of the truck's engine his only companion. The dark highway stretched ahead, an endless ribbon disappearing into the unknown. He should have been used to it by now, the solitude, the silence, but tonight, it felt heavier. His mind replayed the events at the diner, every move and word. The way the bikers had underestimated him. The way he dealt with them without hesitation. It was muscle memory at this point, a part of himself he couldn't leave behind no matter how far he ran. But it wasn't the bikers that lingered in his thoughts. It was Doris, the way she'd looked at him, not with fear but with gratitude. Maybe even a little hope. It was rare for someone to look at him like that, and rarer still for him to feel like he deserved it. Back at the diner, the sheriff lingered after the other customers had gone, sipping a fresh cup of coffee as Doris wiped down the counter. You think he'll come back? The sheriff asked, breaking the silence. Doris shrugged. He doesn't seem like the type to stay anywhere for long. The sheriff chuckled softly. No, he doesn't. But I've got a feeling we haven't seen the last of him. Doris didn't respond. She just stared out the window, her thoughts a million miles away. The bikers, meanwhile, weren't taking their defeat lying down. Scar sat in the back of a dingy bar on the edge of town, his injured pride burning hotter than the whiskey in his glass. Snake Tattoo was nursing his wounded arm, glaring at Scar. We can't let this slide, man. That guy humiliated us. In front of everyone. Scar slammed his glass down on the table, the noise silencing the murmurs of the other bikers. You think I don't know that, he snapped. You think I'm gonna let some old man make fools of us? One of the younger bikers shifted uneasily. He wasn't just some old man, Scar. Did you see the way he moved? He's trained or something. Military, maybe. Scar sneered. I don't care what he is. Nobody does that to us and gets away with it. The room fell silent as Scar leaned back in his chair, his mind working. Finally, he smirked, a cruel glint in his eyes. We're gonna find him. And when we do, he's gonna wish he'd never stepped foot in our territory. Sam pulled into a small, run-down motel on the outskirts of a different town, far enough from the diner to feel like a new world. He parked his truck and sat there for a moment, staring at the neon sign flickering above the office. He knew he shouldn't have stayed as long as he did. The moment he'd seen those bikers walk in, he should have left. But something about the place, about Doris, had made him pause. He checked into the motel and made his way to the room, the key heavy in his hand. The room was sparse but clean, with a single bed and a small TV mounted on the wall. He dropped his bag on the bed and sat down, the weight of the day pressing on him. Reaching into his bag, He pulled out a small, battered notebook. He flipped through its pages, each one filled with names, dates, and cryptic notes. It was a record of the life he was trying to leave behind and a reminder of why he couldn't. Back at the diner, Doris couldn't shake the feeling that Sam's departure wasn't the end of his story in their small town. She locked up for the night, her mind racing with unanswered questions. "Who are you really, Sam?" she whispered to the empty room. The sheriff's words echoed in her mind, "A man like that doesn't just wander through for no reason." She didn't know why, but she hoped she'd see him again. The bikers weren't done with Sam. Scar had already started making calls, pulling in favors and gathering information. It didn't take long for word to spread. A man like Sam didn't blend in as well as he thought. By the time Scar and his gang had a lead, they were ready for revenge. "We'll find him," Scar said, his voice cold and determined. "And when we do, he's not walking away this time." Snake Tattoo grinned, his earlier defeat forgotten in the rush of adrenaline. "Let's make him pay." The gang roared in agreement, their thirst for vengeance driving them forward. The sun had barely begun to rise when Sam's truck pulled into the small town once again. The diner was just starting to open, the first rays of light creeping through the dusty windows. Sam parked his truck in the same spot he had the day before, his boots hitting the pavement with a soft thud as he stepped out. Inside, Doris was already at the counter, wiping it down, preparing for another quiet day. She heard the familiar sound of the truck's engine and glanced up, her heart skipping a beat when she saw Sam walking through the door again. For a brief moment, the diner felt like it was holding its breath. Sam wasn't here for the food, she could tell. He was here because something had drawn him back. Doris tried to push aside the questions she had from yesterday, the curiosity about who Sam really was, and just gave him a warm, welcoming smile. "Morning," she said softly, her voice still thick with the remnants of sleep. Sam gave a small nod. "Morning." He sat at the same booth as before, his usual quietness filling the space between them. The cook was watching him from behind the counter, his hands gripping the edge like they were trying to steady himself. He'd seen what Sam had done to the bikers yesterday. And though he hadn't said anything, the tension in his shoulders told Doris everything. Sam didn't seem to notice the eyes on him. He simply ordered his coffee, the same as yesterday, as though nothing out of the ordinary had happened. But for Doris, nothing felt normal anymore. The door swung open again. This time, it wasn't bikers, at least not the ones who'd caused trouble before, but a group of local men, regulars who'd been coming to the diner for years. They came in, chatting about their morning plans, completely oblivious to the tense energy that lingered in the air. They sat down, ordered their food, and went on with their day. But there was something different about today. The diner, which usually felt like a place of refuge from the rest of the world, now felt like a battleground. At least to Doris. She kept stealing glances at Sam, wondering what was going through his mind. As the morning wore on, it became clear that Sam wasn't just passing through again. He wasn't here for breakfast. And he wasn't here to escape his past. Doris noticed his eyes narrow as he glanced out the window. A shadow seemed to pass over his face as the sounds of the world outside reached him, a subtle shift in his demeanor. He was waiting for something or someone. She could feel the air grow heavier, as if the calm before a storm was approaching. It wasn't long before the sound of motorcycles reached the diner, cutting through the usual quiet hum of morning activity. The rumble of engines was unmistakable. The door opened, and the bikers from yesterday stepped inside, the same gang that Sam had dealt with. Sam didn't move. He didn't flinch, didn't show any sign of recognizing them. He just sat there, looking out the window, his face calm and unreadable. Snake Tattoo, the one who had pushed Sam the hardest yesterday, grinned when he saw Sam. Well, he sneered. "Looks like the old man's back for more." The other bikers stood behind him, looking as cocky and brash as before. They hadn't learned anything from their last encounter. They had come back for revenge, thinking they could push Sam around again. But they didn't know what they were about to walk into. The cook's face turned pale as he watched them approach. He knew what was coming. He had seen it once, and he wasn't sure he was ready to see it again. Doris felt her stomach tighten. She didn't know what to do or say. Part of her wanted to step in, but she also knew that there was nothing she could do. This wasn't something she could stop. This was between Sam and the bikers. Snake Tattoo's voice cut through the quiet. "You think you're untouchable, old man?" He took a step toward Sam, his eyes narrowed, and his hands flexing like he was ready to throw a punch. "You think you can just walk in here and treat us like dirt?" Sam didn't even look at him. His hands remained on the table, his expression still calm. But Doris could see the slight tension in his jaw. She could feel the storm brewing beneath the surface. "I don't want trouble," Sam said, his voice low but steady. Snake Tattoo didn't take the hint. Instead, he stepped closer, his face inches from Sam's. "You already got trouble, old man," he spat. "And we're gonna make sure you don't forget it." Before anyone could blink, Sam moved. He was out of the booth in a flash, his body a blur of controlled power. 1 second, Snake Tattoo was standing, sneering down at Sam. The next, he was on the floor, clutching his wrist in pain. The other bikers froze in shock. It all happened so fast that Doris didn't even have time to process it. One moment, there was a threat in the air. The next, the bikers were scrambling to their feet, their bravado vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. Sam didn't wait for them to recover. He turned and faced the rest of them, his eyes sharp and calculating. "I warned you yesterday," he said, his voice cold, unwavering. "I don't want trouble. But I'll finish it if I have to." The bikers hesitated, eyeing each other, unsure of what to do next. But Sam was already moving again. He grabbed one of them by the arm and spun him around, sending him crashing into a nearby table. Another lunged at him, a knife glinting in his hand, but Sam disarmed him with a single, fluid motion, sending the blade clattering to the floor. The fight was over before it even started. The bikers were on the ground, nursing their wounds, and looking up at Sam with a mix of fear and disbelief. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected him to be the one who walked away unscathed. Sam took a deep breath, adjusted his jacket, and turned toward the door. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. As he walked out of the diner, the bell above the door jingled once more, and the silence that followed was deafening. The bikers didn't move. They didn't speak. They just lay there, defeated, broken by a man they had underestimated. Doris slowly exhaled. She had seen it all unfold before her eyes, and now, she couldn't believe what had just happened. She looked at the cook, who was staring at the door with wide eyes, as if waiting for the world to come crashing down. He really did it," the cook stammered, still trying to process what had just occurred. Doris nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah. He did." They stood in silence for a long moment, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. Sam had left, but the mark he had left on the diner, on the town, would stay forever. And for once, Doris felt like she understood why he had come. Sam didn't want anything from anyone. He wasn't looking for praise, for admiration, or for recognition. He had done what he had to do, and now, he was gone. But justice had been served. And that was enough. The door swung open once more, and the sheriff stepped inside, his gaze sweeping over the bikers still lying on the floor. He didn't need to ask any questions. He already knew what had happened. "He won't be back," Doris said quietly. "Not unless he's running from something." The sheriff looked at her for a long moment before nodding. "I figured as much. But maybe that's the way it should be. Some things, some people, don't belong in places like this. Doris looked out the window, watching as the sun climbed higher into the sky. Maybe. But today, Sam was exactly what this town needed. The sheriff chuckled softly. Maybe so. And as they both stood there, watching the daylight stretch across the town, they couldn't help but feel that, for once, things had worked out the way they should. Justice had been served. And maybe, just maybe, it was enough. Outside, the wind was picking up as Sam climbed onto his motorcycle, the heavy engine rumbling to life beneath him. The sound echoed through the empty streets of the small town, a stark contrast to the silence that had followed the chaos inside the diner. Sam didn't look back. He didn't need to. His leather jacket fluttered slightly as he revved the engine, the road stretching out ahead of him. The day had begun, but for Sam, it was just another chapter in a story he kept close to his chest. No one knew where he was going or why he had come to this little diner in the middle of nowhere. But it didn't matter. He wasn't looking for answers, he was just passing through, like so many others who came and went, unnoticed and unknown. But for the people who had witnessed his actions in the diner, things would never be the same. They would remember Sam, the quiet man who sat alone, the man who seemed to blend into the background, yet was far more than he appeared. They would remember the way he handled the bikers, the way his calm presence had turned the tide in an instant, leaving no doubt in anyone's mind that Sam was someone you did not want to mess with. As Sam's motorcycle sped down the road, the morning sun glinted off the insignia on his wrist. It was simple, unassuming, but it held a history most people wouldn't recognize. To anyone who didn't know, it was just a tattoo. But to those who understood, it was a symbol of strength, training, and experience that few would ever grasp. Sometimes, the quietest man in the room is the one you should fear the most. It's the truth that's often overlooked. The world is full of noise, loud voices, fast movements, bright lights, but in the midst of it all, there are those who stand still, waiting, watching, and learning. These are the people who don't need to shout to make their presence known. They don't need to flex their muscles or show off their power. Their strength lies in their ability to remain calm, to stay patient, and to bide their time until the moment comes when they must act. The bikers in the diner had learned that lesson the hard way. They had underestimated Sam, thinking he was just another old man passing through, someone they could intimidate, someone they could push around. They thought they could toy with him, make fun of him, and walk away with their pride intact. But Sam wasn't the kind of person to back down from a fight, and he wasn't the kind of person to let anyone take him for granted. The bikers didn't see the storm coming. They saw a man who looked harmless, an old man with a quiet demeanor, sitting alone at a table. They didn't see the sharpness in his eyes or the way his body tensed ever so slightly when they approached. They didn't notice the signs, the little movements, the way he held himself, the way he never once lost his cool. All they saw was a target. But Sam didn't need to prove anything to them. He didn't need to show off his skills or remind them of who he was. His actions spoke louder than any words ever could. He moved with precision and purpose, and in seconds, the bikers who had once thought themselves untouchable were lying on the floor, humiliated and defeated. It was a moment of justice, a moment when the quiet, the unassuming, and the often overlooked took control. Sam didn't revel in the violence. He didn't take pleasure in the destruction he had caused. But there was something satisfying in knowing that he had shown the bikers that respect wasn't something that could be demanded through force or fear. It had to be earned. The lesson was clear: those who mistake stillness for weakness, they never see the storm coming. In a world where people are quick to judge others based on their appearance, their actions, or their status, it's easy to overlook the ones who stay silent, the ones who stay in the background. People assume they are harmless, that they are invisible, that they have nothing to offer. But more often than not, it's those quiet ones who are the strongest, the ones who carry the most power without needing to flaunt it. Sam wasn't a hero. He wasn't looking for recognition or admiration. But his actions spoke to something deeper, something that resonated with those who witnessed it. His calm, steady presence was a reminder that strength doesn't always look the way people expect. Sometimes, it's the quietest person in the room who holds the most power, the one who doesn't have to raise their voice to be heard. As Sam rode down the road, leaving the small town behind, he knew that he had done what needed to be done. The bikers had learned their lesson, and the people in the diner had witnessed something that would stick with them for a long time. They would remember Sam, the man who didn't need to fight to win, the man who walked away without a word and left everyone else to pick up the pieces. And as he disappeared into the horizon, Sam couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, the world needed more people like him. Not loud, not flashy, but steady, strong, and unyielding when it counted. Sometimes, the quietest man in the room is the one you should fear the most. And those who mistake stillness for weakness, they never see the storm coming. Because when the storm hits, it's not about how loud you roar or how many people you can scare. It's about the strength you carry inside and the ability to remain calm, even when the world around you is falling apart. In that silence, there's power. And for Sam, that power was enough.